truth is, immigrants tend to be more American than people born here. Stopping illegal immigration would mean that wages would have to rise to a level where Americans would want the jobs currently taken by illegal aliens. Thomas Sowell.
Immigration is going to be a major political problem throughout the next several decades. You have several economic forces all hitting at once that will drastically change the balance on the pros and cons of immigration. And right now, the really biggest challenge is demographic transition. You have a lot of baby boomers and older who are retiring or are leaving the workforce. And as a result, you have not enough young people of equal skills to replace them. The first level solution, which most policy leaders seem to be taking on, is immigration. Because immigration has a lot of short-term benefits that particularly benefit a lot of the donor classes, such as increased demand for domestic goods and services, increased demand for apartments that otherwise would be empty, as well as potentially future vote coalitions that can be used to support your political party's goals. However, these really ignore the longer-term second-order effects of immigration that possibly derail the whole benefit that policymakers are hoping for having it in the first place. Welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. I'm going to explain the economics of immigration. What are the factors that help the economy for immigration? What are the factors that hurt the economy for immigration? And really on the net, are Western nations better off having immigration or not? And if they do, how much immigration is the right level to have to maximize the living standards of existing citizens? Well, first, let's start with the positives of immigration. The main positive, really, of immigration is that it balances out the labor markets and also increases aggregate demand in the economy for consumption. If you have a country with 100 million people and they buy $100 million worth of goods and services in a given year, if you add 10 million more people, even if their income is half that, you're still adding 5% to your total GDP of 5 million. So you now have 105 million of goods and services. And the businesses who are providing those goods and services stand to benefit from having at least that many more customers. So, and that's not even counting possibly that these immigrants have higher birth rates, which means you will have even more customers in subsequent generations. However, that assumption that immigrants are going to always be having higher birth rates might be really tested here, as we've seen birth rates among different demographic groups in Western countries rapidly converge to a shockingly low level just simply due to high costs of living. So that's the one main perk, is that it just increases demand on an aggregate basis. The other thing is that it balances out the labor market. Say if you have jobs that cannot be filled, you'll have immigrants who are willing to fill them. And that's kind of the main other arguments. Like nobody wants to, for example, work in the meat packing factories, or nobody wants to pick grapes in the Central Valley in the summer, or nobody wants to do a lot of these other low-skilled, exhausting, back-breaking labor jobs that older generations used to do when the economy had lower incomes. And so now you need migrants to do it because the current generation of native-born Americans feel too entitled to do it or not. I think that's really just kind of a misguided idea. Yeah, sure, it will help create a little equilibrium, but the dirty secret that they really don't want to tell you about this is it creates an equilibrium at lower wages. And that's really what the main beneficiaries of levels of immigration, both legal and illegal, are the business owning classes, the establishment elite, the counter elite, and the successful business owner classes, and even the Ivy League professional class who has the money to hire domestic labor are all the winners from this. If you did not have the same levels of immigration, you would have to pay people higher wages to do the same amount of stuff. It's not like that demand for picking fruit is going to go away, and farmers aren't going to have several seasons in a row where they just grow crops just to let them die on the vine. And same with all the domestic labor that's done through immigration and construction and other things. What will happen is you'll have a shortage in the short term. What that's going to cause is wages to go up disproportionately in those fields. And as a result, you'll have more native-born people being willing to do those jobs because it actually pays enough for it to make sense. Like, immigration allows wages to be kept down, particularly legal immigration, below subsistence level or below the level that native citizens are willing to do the work. Labor is like any other market. There's supply and demand, and at the right price, there will be enough labor to do the job. And this is why working class wages have consistently been weak until the last few years because of this very dynamic. You either outsource the jobs overseas, and the ones you can't outsource, you replace them by bringing in immigrants who are willing to work for less, are in denial of reality. And yeah, some people will lose. Like, sure, it's going to be a lot more expensive to have your house cleaned or your gardener clean up your lawn, and your fruit's going to be a little more expensive. If you look, I looked at the fruit example specifically because this is the one I get asked, like, it will cost you $10 to buy an apple. No, if you look at, according to the USDA, labor costs as a percentage of the total cost of your fruit at the grocery store is about 6 to 7%. So if labor costs doubled, your apple that's $2 is now going to be $2. And I think paying an extra 7%, at least personally, maybe I might be privileged to say this, is worth the fact of having the social stability benefits and the higher wage scale overall for the paying a little bit extra for certain things that you wouldn't otherwise. That's a value decision that voters really have to make. What do I want? Lower prices at all costs, or would I pay slightly higher price for certain things in exchange for social stability from lower levels of immigration? And you wouldn't be paying higher prices really for everything. There are certain things where increased immigrants increase the demand beyond the sustainable level of supply and do create major price increases. The most critical one of these is housing. A perfect YIMBY world where housing construction was built faster than population growth, then this wouldn't be an issue. But we live in a world where a lot of politics, particularly NIMBY politics in most state and local jurisdictions in the major cities of America, prevent construction. And they prevent construction to the degree that they don't really want any growth. And so as a result, you have the same relative supply of housing, or housing, say, growing at, 0.5% a year, whereas the population in the country is growing at 1.5% a year. And I'm just using rough numbers here. I don't know what the exact ones for either case is, just to prove a point. You are going to have increased housing demand, and these things are done on the margin, and as a result, rents are going to go up much faster than wages. Housing prices are going to go much faster than wages. And that's exactly really what we have seen. The limitation of supply, plus the growth of natural population from family formation and increased immigration, has created this death spiral for housing prices that have basically priced out a large chunk of the population from housing. And those demand for housing translates to higher wages elsewhere because people won't move to a certain city unless if their salary can afford to pay these higher levels of rent. And in countries that are more real estate driven and have more higher percentages of immigration relative to the population, have even worse problems. Look at Canada and Australia. They have much higher levels as a percent of their population of legal immigration than the United States does. Their housing prices, along with their demographics shifting in the way of aging a little bit faster, also contributed it. You've seen housing prices stagnate and decline. Housing is now a depreciating asset like a car is in the Western world, in Japan. And this is driven by just simple supply and demand. Japan is starting to increase its immigration a little bit, but not really enough to the levels to flood their housing market. And Japan is a functioning first world society that has had effectively zero net immigration, or very, very small numbers until recently, over the last 30 years. And they haven't been able to fall apart. They still have people doing the low skilled labor there. It's just that wages had to get high enough for it to make sense. And or the Japanese respond through innovation. They've become the leading innovator in robotics technology. And they've used advancements in robotics and software to be able to compensate for the lack of physical manpower. And when you eliminate a class of laborers, whether it's through slavery, whether it's through illegal immigration working below minimum wage, or just excess amounts of people willing to work below subsistence level for whatever reason, whenever you abolish that practice, it has in massive levels of technological growth and advancement. And I don't see why we wouldn't have the same thing. And we're having the same thing even now. Like, AI is coming, and AI, along with advancement in personal robots, which I've talked about in previous videos, is going to change the labor supply demand dynamic from a shortage, which we are seeing now due to boomers retiring before AI is really ready to step up to the game, to a major labor glut. And if you keep adding certain levels of immigration that you are at right now, you are going to make that glut even worse. And what is more socially destabilizing than bringing a bunch of people in from another country who don't have any work for them to do, and the native borners competing against robots as well? That's a problem. You're like bringing essentially the emerging market middle income trap, or the AI ladder pull, which I've mentioned in several of my economic futures videos. You're going to bring that problem and import it into the developed world through migrant populations. And as a result of all of this, and you could see, I have showed charts here of wages relative on all education levels. The immigration on the bottom lowers wages across the board, and whatever the base level is at the bottom kind of sets the wage scale as a whole. Like, example is, if somebody is working at the bottom level is $5 an hour, and only immigrants are willing to work at that level, just say for example, then somebody who's, say, working at a semi-skilled job whose rate is based on double subsistence is going to be making paid $10 an hour. And then college-educated workers who do more advanced work are maybe getting paid $15 an hour. And they're all kind of ratios based on the base low rate. So say, for example, now you cut out the labor who's willing to work at $5 an hour just through tightening up immigration policy. Then you now have the base wage for the lowest menial labor jobs is now up to 10. So those who are making who have higher skill sets are going to be able to demand higher labor wages, because they're not going to work for the same as the menial job. Otherwise, they'll just switch to doing the menial job because it probably is less stressful and or might be more flexible, might be other benefits. And so in order to compete to get the higher skilled labor, employers are going to have to raise their wages so that it still has that same relative premium over the base lower wage. And so, like, people say economic growth was a result of trickle-down economics, which I kind of challenge the idea of trickle-down economics, but that's for another video. Wages work in a trickle-up way. The low base of the wage sets the scale for all the other salaried employees up the entire curve, unless if you're somebody who's like an exceptional talent who can negotiate just on their own personal brand or skill that's not easily replaceable, and have employers competing on that way. But most people whose jobs are somewhat standardized are really kind of based on the bottom end of the wage curve. So the thing is that I'm going to get as a counter argument is, yeah, Nick, that sounds great. You want to raise wages for the bottom end. And even if the inflation there is in terms of some goods and services, you might be made up through housing deflation due to a lack of people competing for the same amount of housing. But by pursuing such a restrictionist policy in immigration, won't governments effectively basically lock out their next great entrepreneurs? You have a lot of the brightest entrepreneurs in America are immigrants from other countries, and they've formed some of the great startups that are some of the major employers and source of competitive advantage in the United States and other Western countries today. So do you want to just prevent the talent of the world from coming to your countries? Isn't that what America is built off of, is getting everybody's first round draft picks, metaphorically? You can have a sensible immigration policy that still brings in the best talent without screwing up the entire wage curve. These aren't mutually exclusive. I think Singapore is a good example of this. I don't know if they still have this policy, but they had this policy 10 to 15 years ago where you can hire any foreigner you want as long as you're willing to pay them 20% above the going wage that you would pay a local for the same job. And any business is not going to pay 20% above the going rate for the same job unless if the foreigner is 20% better than their American equivalent. This kind of works well for everybody. The immigrants, because of this policy, will get paid better. They will have living wages, and they will not be dragging down the wage curve for everybody else. Or just if raw supply numbers do impact that somewhat, it'll be a lot less bad, because you can't really, immigrants can no longer compete solely on cost. They compete on talent. And if they have better talent, you should be allowed to hire them. And you should actually make the H-1B process easier to let these top talents in, because the market will be the force that decides, hey, wait, if somebody really is 20% better than their native-born equivalent, why should we turn them down? You can also do that for same people, say, who've gone to more elite universities, like top 50 bachelor's degrees, and say, hey, you know what? I'm not saying you should give a green card for every bachelor's degree, but usually people who are at those elite universities are probably at least 20% more talented than the median university student in America. And so as a result, if they can get a job that pays them more than their local equivalent, if employers are willing to pay because they're that much more talented, then that will retain the really great talent in this country. You can also give visa exceptions for startups. Like if you have a startup that is funded, whether by local venture capital or by their own savings of the founder, enough to keep the founder financially viable for at least 3 years and finance the initial operations of the growth, why shouldn't they be allowed to stay too? There are other people who are willing to sponsor their entrepreneurial ambitions, and we want to have that great business built in our country. But we want the upside of the best talent coming here without the downside of degrading the entire wage scale by just letting in a flood of people who really only compete on price and not on talent. The other real hidden cost of immigration, really, in the economics of immigration that is not really discussed, is the increased cost of lower trust. I talked about this in a video of social trust, about the economic consequences of low trust society, and there is a lot of research to show that increased levels of immigration and lack of cultural assimilation results in increased levels of social distrust, which has a lot of negative economic costs in both terms of hard dollars and in other expenses that would not have popped up in a higher trust society. If you want more details on the social trust component, watch my video on the economic cost of low trust societies, which I'll have a link into the description here, where I go more into that. But the general idea is that immigration can also have major negatives in terms of social trust levels. And yeah, you might be bringing in this increased demand temporarily, but at what cost? Are you going to have a cost of lowering your wage scale structurally, at raising your cost of living structurally, particularly housing, due to the supply-demand dynamics due to a flood of people, and also the cost of lower social trust? Again, the main losers from a restrictionist policy are the upper classes, the business owners, and the elites who either hire domestic help or hire employees at lower wages. The winners of restricted immigration are the middle and lower classes, whose wages are going to go up because the wage scale gets reset higher. I think really a good compromise is the talent provision idea that I mentioned. You do allow options for entrepreneurs and skilled labor who is legitimately more talented than their domestic competition, and allow them to be here. We want the best and brightest in the United States and in the West. We just do not want we want the positives of having the best and brightest in the country without the negatives of mass immigration that is not being properly regulated. So that might be your solution. Lower the barriers for the really truly talented, but increase the barriers for people competing on price. Then let me know your thoughts on this. What do you think about immigration? Do you think that immigration, even among low-skilled immigrants, is a net benefit to the U.S.? Do you think that we just don't need any more immigration at all, and there's just too many people here, and we're not going to be able to absorb and assimilate the costs? And again, this calculation of social trust also varies by countries. In the U.S., which has a great history of assimilating immigrants, the social costs are much lower for immigration, because the American model as long as people really buy into the rules of the game, anybody from any background can succeed and they can assimilate. And generally, especially based on language preferences of second and third generation immigrants, they generally succeed at assimilating. Whereas in other countries where nationality and the national dream is based on ethnic and cultural ties, the social costs of immigration are much higher and they can tolerate much lower levels of immigration. Like having open door to the best and brightest talent in the US could work, and Canada and Australia, but it's probably not going to work in Europe or in Japan for cultural reasons that I mentioned. And people are just not willing to put, in my opinion, enough nuance into this conversation. I think that, again, there has to be a practical solution that's not just either open borders and let everybody should have a right to live wherever they want, or on the other side where we need to keep the demographic balance of the US pinned to the level it was in 1950. Neither of those are really viable answers. We do have a real economic concern, but just blindly letting in immigration, especially immigrants who do not have the same skill set or education levels or cultural assimilation as the previous generation of native-born citizens who are retiring, it's going to cause inevitable problems. And since most governments are very bad at handling immigration policy, the net benefit of immigration is usually worse than the net drawbacks over a long period of time. In the shorter time frame, the boosted GDP and the boosted aggregate demand and the balancing of the labor market and the increased profits for business owners as a result of it are good, and those are front-loaded. Whereas the back-end consequences in terms of social trust, higher structural costs of living, and lower wage scales across the board are longer-term and more negative. Like that, and people just don't really see it because they don't show up till 5 to 10 years later. Like the immigration problem started during the George W. Bush administration, really, in scale. But the negative consequences of immigration didn't really become more apparent until the middle of the Obama presidency. And this time preference issue, which I talked about in my previous video about voting in line with your class, is just something people fail to see. And the second order effects people fail to see. And that is kind of my conclusion on this topic. I mean, again, I would like to hear comments people who agree or disagree. I know it's probably one of the more controversial videos I've done on this channel, but I appreciate your guys' support and thank you for watching.